Welcome back, everyone. Well, everybody has been commenting, even on videos that have nothing to do with the subject, asking when I'm going to talk about what's going on right now in the Middle East with Iran, where I was just a couple weeks ago in the Middle East myself, and in Oman, which is one of the places where some of the explosions have happened. And so I do want to talk a little bit about it, but I want to talk about it in a very specific way. And I want to just state this up front because I feel like we are all, myself included, way too willing to give knee-jerk reactions in the moment without taking time to see what's going on, to hear and to understand, and to let things play out a little bit. And I'm not saying that there isn't a time and place right now for people to offer opinions and viewpoints on all this stuff. I'm just saying I'm not personally there yet. So what I want to actually do is I've been reading a lot of social media and I'm seeing a lot of stuff on the news related to the legality of the use of U.S. troops in this attack on Iran, specifically as it relates to the War Powers Act or the War Powers Resolution of 1973. So what I want to do, rather than kind of talk about the morality and the ethics involved with this, which is certainly a conversation to have, is I want to look at the history of the United States' use of military force without a declaration of war, especially since 1973 when the War Powers Act was passed, and talk a little bit about what the War Powers Act is, what it's not, how it's been stretched and misinterpreted and all that sort of thing. So we're going to dive into all of that in this video today, and as always, I would love to hear your thoughts on all of that. But before we get into that, just in case you haven't already seen it, I posted a video a couple days ago announcing pre-sale of my new book, Trumbull County Boys, which is the story of Company H of the 20th Ohio in the American Civil War. It follows the men of a single company from the time they enlisted to the time that they all died after the war. So TrumbleCountyBoys.com. The link is in the description as well as pinned down in the comment section below. Right now we're just doing a pre-sale of hardcover signed copies of the book. So those are a little more than the standard book will be. So later on, we'll be announcing a regular hardcover and eventually a paperback version of the book. The release date's April 6th, so that's when we'll be shipping all those out, if not sooner. So check all of that out. You can read all about the book, learn more about what it is, and you can order your pre-sale signed hardcover copy if you want to do that today. All right, let's dive into this topic. So first, let's talk about declarations of war. The United States Constitution delegates the authority for declaring war on another nation to the United States Congress, which it has done in 5 different wars over time. There's more than 5 declarations because there have been multiple declarations with each of those wars. But we have declared war in 5 separate conflicts against. So we're talking about World War I and World War II. We're talking about the War of 1812, the war with Mexico, and the war with Spain. I know I did those out of order, but those are the 5 times that the United States has officially declared war through Congress on other nations. Now, as far as times that the military has been used without a declaration of war, there's a bunch of them, and these are varying degrees. So some of you might say, well, okay, that one you shared, we didn't really do too much there. That's true, but I just want to give you some examples throughout history. 1798 to 1800, this is during the John Adams administration. We have what's called the Quasi-War, which was an undeclared naval war that was pretty much all at sea, and it was disputes over neutrality and the seizing of American ships, which is some of the same stuff that leads to the declaration of war on the United Kingdom in 1812. But we have the first Barbary War under Thomas Jefferson, where Thomas Jefferson sends the Navy to the Mediterranean to fight against Barbary pirates. And then there's a second Barbary War in 1815, which is kind of a brief resumption of hostilities. We have the Seminole War under General Andrew Jackson, and that happens 1817, 1818. Where troops are sent into Spanish-controlled Florida to fight against the Seminole tribes who were raiding into Georgia in settlements and were also harboring escaped enslaved people. And again, listen, I'm not arguing the merits of any of these. I'm just giving you the facts. 1832 and 1838, you have the Sumatran expeditions, which is, again, the U.S. Navy dispatched to the Dutch East Indies, what is now Indonesia. to attack coastal villages in retaliation for the capture and looting of American merchant ships. And understand that while all of this is going on, we also have the United States Navy alongside the British Navy sailing off the coast of West Africa and using our military power to put a stop to the slave trade. So that's all going on at the same time. In 1871, there's a U.S. expedition to Korea, which originally was a diplomatic mission to establish trade, kind of like we did with the Japanese, right? It escalates into an armed conflict when Korean shore batteries fired on U.S. ships, leading to a U.S. Marine assault that captures several forts and kills over 200 Korean defenders. 1899 to 1902, you have the Philippine-American War, which is a topic we have talked a lot about. After Spain cedes the Philippines to the United States, Filipino revolutionaries who had been fighting for independence already turned their weapons against the American occupying forces. This results in a brutal guerrilla war that lasts for several years. Also in 1899 to 1901, you have the Boxer Rebellion, where the U.S. deploys thousands of troops to China as part of an 8-nation alliance to suppress anti-imperialist Boxer Rebellion and lift the siege of the foreign legations in Beijing. And then, of course, you have what we call the Banana Wars and the Mexican interventions, which 1912 to 1933, you have U.S. Marines deployed to Nicaragua to ensure the stability of a pro-American government. Sounds very modern with that one. 1914, you have the occupation of Veracruz following the arrest of American sailors in Tampico, Mexico. Of course, you have the Mexican punitive expedition to go after Pancho Villa, who had been raiding into the southern United States. You have the occupation of Haiti, the occupation of the Dominican Republic by American forces, and then most recently, before the declared war in World War II, you have the intervention in the Russian Civil War. We have the Polar Bear expedition, which not a lot of people talk about. This is when, after World War I, the Russian Civil War is going on, and U.S. troops are sent into the northern parts of Russia and into Siberia to guard Allied stockpiles, to rescue the Czechoslovak Legion, and to covertly support the anti-Bolshevik white forces. In fact, in the book that I just mentioned that I wrote, the great-grandson of the first company commander of Company H received a Distinguished Service Cross when he was killed as part of the Polar Bear expedition. So those are just some of the examples, and I'm sure there are some other ones out there, but there is a long history of the United States military being used in a combat capacity without any formal declaration of war. And it often happens in situations where you are dealing with an extra governmental agency or some rebels or someone who's not necessarily the official military of the government that you're fighting. But in some cases that has happened. So then that leads us to the 20th century. And since World War II, obviously the United States has been involved in a number of major wars and military actions. You have the Korean conflict, which people often call it that rather than a war because there was no declaration of war. But you're talking about tens of thousands of Americans that die in that war, along with many, many more of other nations. You have Vietnam from the 1950s into the 1970s. You have, of course, the Gulf War, the Persian Gulf War in 1990-91. You have U.S. troops going into Panama and into other places as well for raids and things of that nature. We launched airstrikes on Libya in the 1980s to try and take out Muammar Gaddafi. Then you get into, of course, the war in Afghanistan, the war in Iraq in the 2000s, and then you have ISIS, and you have Syria and Libya once again, and you have now, of course, Iran on multiple occasions. And all of those things happened without an official declaration of war. But in many of those cases, there was congressional action of varying degrees. So, there are certainly examples of that happening. But as I did my research into this, of course, this brings us to the War Powers Act, or the War Powers Resolution of 1973. This is passed in the waning days of U.S. military involvement in Vietnam, which was a long war that cost the lives of 60,000 Americans and probably millions of other people without a declaration of war. happening in Congress. And so Congress is trying to rein in the executive power to be able to send troops without a declaration of war. And they passed this, which is then vetoed by President Richard Nixon. And then Congress comes back, both the House and the Senate, and they override the veto of Richard Nixon. So that brings us to a couple of things. Number one, what has happened since then? And what exactly does the War Powers Act allow the president to do on his own without any congressional action? And what is Congress's role in that? So we're going to talk a little bit about all that stuff. But first I want to say that every single president since 1973 has ordered U.S. troops into a combat situation at least once without a declaration of war. You could kind of argue maybe Jimmy Carter didn't, because the one time he ordered U.S. troops into harm's way was a rescue mission to try and get the hostages that were being held in Iran for 444 days. And that ended in that being unsuccessful because it ended up crashing before they were able to actually even get into the combat zone. So some might argue, well, Jimmy Carter didn't. Well, it's not for lack of trying. And obviously there's a big difference between sending troops into a rescue mission and launching major airstrikes on a nation. So, but with that in mind, every president has done it in some capacity, going back all the way to when that was passed. So let's look at the text of the War Powers Act. So before we dive into this, I just want to say something that I feel like I have to say because we as human beings tend to view everything through our own biases, our own predisposed notions about things, and because most people who are watching this video right now have already formed an opinion one way or another about whether you support or oppose the actions being taken by Israel and by the United States in Iran. Because of that, I know that you're going to be tempted to hear everything I'm saying through that lens. So I want to be crystal clear about something, okay? None of what I'm saying should be interpreted as an endorsement of the attacks on Iran. They should not be interpreted as support for Donald Trump or opposition to what's happening in Iran, or opposition to Donald Trump, or to any of the other presidents that we'll talk about. I am simply trying to offer a historical context so that everybody can make up their own minds, and you're free to do that. I'm not offering an opinion. Honestly, I don't know how I feel about it yet. I tend to want to wait to see how it all plays out. But understand that when this act was passed, it was passed in the context of the end of Vietnam. And like everything that U.S. Congress does, it is open to interpretation by the one interpreting it. So every president who's come along, whether they be Democrat or Republican, has looked at this act and interpreted it to fit their own needs. And it's up to Congress and it's up to the Supreme Court to say, yeah, you interpreted it correctly, or no, you're wrong, and we're going to rein you in. Now, traditionally, in the last 50 years, Congress and the Supreme Court hasn't necessarily done a ton of reining in of the executive, but they do sometimes. And so that's kind of the purpose of this act. So let's take a look at some of the text, and I'll pull it up on the screen for you here. So first of all, there's this really tricky part at the beginning where in Part C of kind of the introduction to the bill, where it says the constitutional powers of the president as commander-in-chief to introduce United States armed forces into hostilities or into situations where imminent involvement in hostilities is clearly indicated by the circumstances are exercised only pursuant to a declaration of war, specific statutory authorization, or national emergency created by an attack upon the United States, its territories or possessions, or its armed forces. So even just in that statement, presidents have come to wildly differing conclusions about what that means. So for example, George W. Bush, under number 2, specific statutory authorization, argued that the authorization of the use of military force as passed by Congress in 2002 gave him, under this statute, the right to invade Iraq. Others argued that he didn't meet the obligations that Congress set out in that authorization of the use of military force. Also, that same authorization for the use of military force was later used by the Obama administration, for example, when they sent troops into the Mediterranean region. So, was it meant for that? Again, it's up to the executive to interpret and enforce that, and then it's up to the Congress and the Supreme Court to say, no, that's not what we meant. No, that's not what that law is for. So let's get into some of the nitty-gritty details of this. And I'm not going to read, we could go through, and I'll link this if you want to look at it from Cornell Law School, all of the actual text of the War Powers Act from November of 1973. So, for example, it says a president in every possible instance shall consult with Congress before introducing United States Armed Forces into hostilities or into situations where imminent involvement in hostilities is clearly indicated by the circumstances. And after every such introduction shall consult regularly with the Congress until the U.S. Armed Forces are no longer engaged in hostilities. And then it goes on to describe exactly what the timeline looks like for doing all of that. But I'm not going to read all of that. I'm just going to go ahead and go to the Congress website, congress.gov, where they give a summary of this. Now, granted, this is Michael Green writing this for the Library of Congress, so it could be argued this is his own interpretation of what it means, but it's the best way to kind of give an overview of this. So it was adopted in 73. It gives fast-track procedures to provide an opportunity for members of Congress to obtain a vote on, or more often in relation to, legislation that either authorizes the use of force or directs their removal. Before the president commits troops into hostilities abroad, he is directed that Congress first be consulted in every possible instance. And of course, then a president can argue, well, it wasn't possible in this instance, right? The War Powers Resolution further mandates that the president report to Congress within 48 hours of deploying U.S. forces if Congress has not declared war or statutorily authorized the action. So for those who are interpreting the opening part to say the president can't send troops into action without prior approval of Congress, this would seem to indicate that's not what that meant, because it's saying here that if he hasn't already gotten approval from Congress, then he needs to report to Congress within 48 hours if that hasn't happened. The president must continue reporting to Congress at least every 6 months for the duration of the engagement. 60 days after the president first reports to Congress or was required to do so, the use of the armed forces is automatically terminated unless Congress has declared war or passed legislation authorizing the action. The president may extend the 60-day period an additional 30 days by certifying in writing to Congress the need for continued use of force. So that is what has led to what you'll often hear stated in the media or by presidents, is that basically the president can pretty much do what he wants for 60 days as long as he's keeping Congress in the loop about what he's doing. Now, you can argue that's not what this says, but that has generally been how presidents have operated. They've operated under the assumption that they've got 60 days. And so if they launch airstrikes for 3 or 4 days like they did last year, or for 12 days against Iran, but it doesn't go longer than 60 days, and they're also informing members of Congress about what's going on, the proper committees, which some of those committees are listed in the War Powers Resolution, then most presidents have said, you know what, I've done my duty under the law. But there have been exceptions to that. And one notable example is when President Obama sent troops into Syria and into Libya. In fact, I want to pull that up for just a second. Actually, before I do that, I do want to look at something else. So it's commonly understood then that the way that Congress kind of uses the War Powers Resolution at that point is if the president does send troops into a situation like we're doing right now in Iran, and Congress doesn't agree with that use of force, they can pass a bill that puts a stop to it and orders the president to pull the armed forces out of that situation. That hasn't really happened, But, because it would be pretty difficult to do that, especially when you're not going to probably get the president's own party to go against him in a situation like that. What we do see here is says any bill or joint resolution directing the president to remove U.S. forces abroad may be introduced in either chamber at any time. The Senate considers such measures under a modified version of the procedures found in the Internal Security Assistance and Arms Export Control Act of '76. Upon introduction and referral, the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations must report within 10 days of continuous session. There's a lot of words, I know. Or can be discharged by a privilege motion that is debatable for 1 hour. And so on and so forth. It gives kind of with all of that, but the president can then veto that. So you're going to need to be able to override the president's veto, or else you're not putting a stop to it. So the point in saying that is, as it applies to the current situation, it's highly unlikely that a veto-proof majority of both houses of Congress are going to vote to tell President Trump to cease hostilities with Iran. It's really just, let's be honest. Whatever you think of it, that's just not a reality. So the president's going to be able to continue to do this. So then it says, alternatively, members of Congress may introduce a concurrent resolution at any time directing the removal of U.S. armed forces. However, in 1983, the Supreme Court effectively found measures like these to be unconstitutional because they did not require presentation to the president. As a result, Congress amended the War Powers Resolution to provide for expedited consideration of a bill or joint resolution in the Senate, but did not eliminate the procedures for consideration of concurrent resolutions. So all of that talks about the ways that the Congress can kind of order the president to stop. And then, of course, there's a whole lot more to all of this. So obviously, I am giving like a really brief and in no way nuanced or detailed summary of what this is about. And you are free to read all of this. I'm going to link both of these, both the actual text and then also this description of the bill and how it operates and how it's been used. But I want to look at a couple of examples from the past 20, 30 years. So the first thing I just want to highlight is right here, which is that it has been alleged that the War Powers Resolution has been violated in the past. However, Congress has disapproved all such incidents, and no allegations have resulted in successful legal actions taken against a president. And that's really important because the way that the politics of this works is that when you have a Democrat president that sends the U.S. military into a combat situation, the Republicans in Congress are all up in arms saying that it's a violation of the War Powers Resolution. And when a Republican president sends U.S. military into combat situations, the Democrats in Congress say that it's a violation of the War Powers Resolution. It's all politics. It has never resulted in any kind of actual court case or congressional action that has declared as much. It just hasn't happened. So let's go ahead and go to some more modern examples of this. So specifically, we have in 2011. I'm actually just going to go back to the version that's on this page here because I think that's a better summary of it. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton testified to Congress in March 2011 that the Obama administration did not need congressional authorization for its military intervention in Libya or for further decisions about it, despite congressional objections from members of both parties that the administration was violating the War Powers Resolution. So this is exactly what you're going to hear this time around too, right? Is you're going to have the Trump administration arguing we don't need congressional approval. And we don't need Congress to be involved in this at all. We're going to get in and out within 60 days and it'll be fine. So that was the argument being made there. And then it says months later, she stated that with respect to military operation in Libya, the United States was still flying a quarter of the sorties even after the 60-day limit. And the New York Times reported that while many presidents had bypassed other sections of the War Powers Resolution, there was little precedent for exceeding the 60-day statutory limit on unauthorized military actions, a limit which the Justice Department had said in 1980 was constitutional. The State Department publicly took the position in June 2011 that there was no hostility in Libya with the meaning of the War Powers Resolution, within the meeting, contrary to legal interpretations by the Department of Defense. So what they were saying was, yes, our troops are being used in Libya, but they're not in a war zone. So it doesn't apply. It's kind of and like I said, that's where this all comes down to the interpretation of whatever administration is justifying their own actions. May 20th, 2011 marked the 60th day of U.S. combat, but the deadline arrived without the president seeking specific authorization from Congress. He notified Congress that no authorization was needed since U.S. leadership had been transferred to NATO. So again, there's the loophole, right? It's like, yeah, well, we're not in charge of it. Our troops are involved, but we're not the ones in charge of it. It's a NATO action. And the U.S. involvement is somewhat limited at that point. Then in Syria, this is again under the Obama administration. Late 2012, early 23, at the direction of the president, the CIA was put in charge of Timber Sycamore, a covert program to arm and train rebels who were fighting against Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. And then, of course, eventually you have, in this case, the president does ask Congress for authorization to use military force in Syria, much like President Bush had asked for an authorization of use of military force in Iraq. And Congress rejected that. Now, Congress didn't actually vote on it, to my knowledge. I think it was a bill that was introduced, and it just got tabled and was never even voted on. And it was pretty mixed support for it. And so then following the use of chemical weapons in the Syrian civil war, Obama asked Congress, which they rejected. Instead, Congress passed a bill that specified that the defense secretary was authorized to, quote, provide assistance, including training, equipment, supplies, and sustainment to appropriately vetted elements of the Syrian opposition and other appropriately vetted Syrian groups and individuals. The bill specifically prohibited the introduction of U.S. troops or other U.S. forces into hostilities. The bill said nothing in this section shall be construed to constitute a specific statutory authorization for the introduction of United States armed forces into hostilities or into situations wherein hostilities are clearly indicated by the circumstances. That's a direct quote to the 1973 War Powers Act. In spite of the prohibition, Obama and then also later United States President Donald Trump introduced ground forces into Syria, and the U.S. became fully engaged in the country, though these troops were primarily for training Allied forces, which you could interpret as being okay under this. On April 6th, 2017, that's pretty much the 100th anniversary of our declaration of war in the First World War, isn't it? The U.S. launched 59 Tomahawk missiles into Syria in response to their alleged use of chemical weapons. Constitutional law professor scholar and law professor Stephen Vladeck has noted that the strike probably violated the War Powers Resolution. Again, it's all up to who's interpreting it, right? Yemen, same deal. This now we're talking about Donald Trump. In 2018, Senators Bernie Sanders, Chris Murphy, and Mike Lee. So you've got an independent who caucuses with the Democrats. You have a Democrat, and you have a conservative Republican. Sponsored a bill to invoke the War Powers Resolution and to end U.S. support for the Saudi-led military intervention in Yemen. So this is an example under the War Powers Resolution where Congress will step in and say, we are exercising our authority to order the president to cease this. And it was introduced in the 115th Congress, but the Senate voted to table the motion. Interest grew in the bill after the assassination of Jamal Khashoggi in 2018. And again, they voted 56-41 to invoke the War Powers Resolution, but the House didn't vote, and in either case, the president would have just vetoed it. So it was introduced again in 2019, and that time it was passed by both houses of Congress, and it was vetoed by the president. And they did not override the veto. So, and then you see other examples of that, including the most recent one in Iran. And so this is all what you're going to be hearing about with this case. So all of that is to say that, like everything in politics, it's complicated and it depends entirely on who it is that you're listening to. If you think that this use of military force is immoral and illegal and should not be done, you're very likely to believe that the War Powers Act of 1973 is clear that the president does not have the authority to do what he's doing in Iran right now. If you believe it was a good thing and that we should be involved. You're very likely to believe that under the War Powers Act of 1973, the president is completely within his power to do what he's doing. And the fact is that in every other situation like the one we're dealing with in Iran right now, in every other situation, it has played out that the president has been able to do it. So I think that's 99.9% likely to be the case here. The odds that you're going to see Congress in both houses pass with a veto-proof majority a bill that declares that the president is not authorized to use force in Iran is next to zero. It's really, really unlikely unless something dramatic happens to change a lot of people's minds on this. That is in no way meant to argue that we can't debate the morality of it, the ethics of it, whether it's even our problem, whether or not there is a threat to the United States that needed to be dealt with. Those are all perfectly acceptable things for us to be debating and talking about. And it's a healthy thing for us to debate and talk about those things. But just understand, cut through all the noise. When you hear people talking about the War Powers Act, understand that this is the context and understand it's likely to be a whole lot of political posturing that's going to amount to probably nothing. So I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comment section below. As always, debate the merits of everything I've said and of what's going on right now, but do so in a way that's respectful, that sticks to the facts and the evidence and the specifics of what we're talking about and not results in name calling and insults. And yes, I know many of the politicians do just that. We can be better. We can call them out when they do it, and I'm calling you out when you do it, and call me out when I do it. Let's be better than that. So let me know your thoughts. Use the comment section below. Please consider checking out TrumbullCountyBoys.com and picking up the pre-sale copy of the book. If not, wait a little while. There will be other versions available that won't be quite as expensive as that one if you don't want to have a hardcover autographed edition. And for those of you who are outside the United States, right now it's just within the U.S. and it's free shipping to the U.S. If you're outside the U.S., it's coming in the next few days. I'm going to have those available for people in other parts of the world. So stay tuned. Thanks for watching.